Hello, beautiful second graders. This is our last chapter of our Fireside Read Aloud. I've got my reading buddy Ella here. She's comfy cozy. It's that same day that I recorded the last one, but it is a rainy, windy, kind of colder day, so a perfect day for reading a good book next to the fire. So let's get started to see what happens with our last chapter. Chapter 10, the mystery is solved. All right, the following morning, Amira joined the Aldens in Benny and Henry's room after breakfast. Jessie filled Amira in on what had happened the night before. Do you think the Coolies are thieves? Amira asked. If not, what were they doing in the kitchen last night? We know they weren't there for a snack. And they claimed to be photographers, but they didn't know how to put film in my camera, Violet added. You're right, Amira said. They're not photographers at all. I talked to them last night at dinner. They're antique dealers, and they travel all over the country looking for unusual items. They noticed that school clock in Mrs. Parsons' kitchen, and were planning to take a picture of it. They thought one of their customers might like to buy it. But why didn't they do it in the daytime? Benny asked. Probably because they didn't want Mrs. Parsons to know it was valuable, Amira explained. This way they could buy it from her at a much better price. Well, that explains that, said Henry. And I figured out the truth about Mrs. Wentworth, Benny said suddenly. You did? Violet and Jessie chorused. She's going to open her own B&B. She told me at breakfast. Benny looked very pleased with himself. So that's why she was so nosy, Henry said, and why she said someone could make a pretty penny out of Mrs. Parsons' place. What about John Settereth? Jessie said. Remember when you saw him standing in room 6? I asked him about that this morning. Violet explained. He was just admiring the view of the Washington skyline. He wants to use it on a series of billboards he's designing. Billboards? Henry asked. Violet nodded. He's a commercial artist. She grinned. That explains why he didn't know much about fine art that day in the museum. That only leaves Peter Marshall, said Henry. I wish there was some other explanation, Violet said sadly. She liked Peter and hated to think that he was involved in the thefts. Henry took a deep breath. I think we should talk to Mrs. Parsons right now. Peter almost finished serving breakfast, and we need to catch him before he dashes off to class. I think you're right, Jessie led the way downstairs. This is hard to believe, Mrs. Parsons said a few minutes later in the kitchen. Henry had just told her about Peter and the security mirror, and she glanced at the swinging door in the dining room. What will I say to him? How can I accuse him? Just then Peter appeared carrying an empty platter. We're running a little short on waffles, he said cheerfully. Shall I make some more batter? He noticed the Aldens standing by the stove. Why aren't you in the dining room? Aren't you hungry? Sit down, Peter, Mrs. Parsons said. Her voice was surprisingly strong. While the Aldens stood silently by, she told him exactly what they had just told her. When she finished, Peter looked pale and shaken. I didn't think, he began and then stopped. Peter, just tell me the truth, Mrs. Parsons urged him. She rested her hand on his arm for a moment. Are you the one who's been taking things from the house? There was a long silence while Peter tried to compose himself. Yes, he said. I'm afraid so. Oh, Peter, Mrs. Parsons said softly. Why? Why did you do it? It's hard to explain, he began. He looked miserable. I never thought you'd noticed. You didn't think I'd notice money missing from the safe or my good Jefferson plate? I thought I could replace the money before you looked in the safe, he said. And the Jefferson plate isn't gone forever. It's at the pawn shop. I was going to get it back for you just as soon as I had the money. But why did you do it? Mrs. Parsons looked bewildered. Why would you steal from me? There's no excuse for what I did, Peter said flatly. None at all. He paused. But I honestly never meant to hurt you. I didn't have enough money to pay my tuition this semester, and I didn't know what else to do. I was so desperate. I even took a roll of stamps out of your desk. Peter, I would have gladly loaned you the money, gladly. Peter gave a sad smile. I realize that now. I should have come to you right away. I can't believe I did such a stupid thing. Mrs. Parson thought for a moment. You didn't just steal from me, you know. What about Mrs. Wentworth's brooch and that young couple's traveler's checks? The brooch is at the pawn shop. He looked embarrassed. I took the traveler's checks and then I felt so guilty I put them back behind the dresser. Peter, I just can't believe you did this. Mrs. Parsons looked at like she was ready to cry. It was a mistake, he said earnestly, a terrible mistake. You've been so kind to me, and I let you down. Mrs. Parsons stood up. Well, we have to figure out how to straighten out this mess. I think the first thing you need to do is apologize to Mrs. Wentworth. I'll loan you the money to get her brooch back from the pawn shop. You will? Peter stood up too. Aren't you going to call the police? Mrs. Parsons patted him on the shoulder. I don't know, Peter. You've made a bad mistake. Perhaps you can make it up by working extra hours. In the meantime, this afternoon, let's sit down together and see how much money you need for the rest of your schooling. We can work out a loan from the bank. Thank you, he said, squeezing her hand. I won't let you down again, I promise. After a busy day of sightseeing, Myra and the Aldens made their way back to Mrs. Parsons. At least the mystery had been solved, said Jessie. Yes, but, and Myra began, I have a confession to make too. They turned the corner onto the Parsons tree-lined street. You do? Violet stared at her. But Peter Marshall confessed to the thefts. And Myra laughed. Oh, I don't steal anything, but I haven't been completely honest with you. I knew there was something funny about you, Betty said. You couldn't tell fish sticks from French fries. You're right, Benny, and Myra admitted. That's because I had never seen them before. Wow, Benny said softly. Where are you from? He couldn't imagine a place without fish sticks and French fries. I'm from Egypt, very far from here, Benny, and Myra explained. We have a cousin Sue Lee who's from far away too, said Benny. But why didn't you tell us? Violet asked. She felt hurt that her friend had lied to her. I wanted to see what it was like to live a normal life for a couple of weeks. My father works for the embassy, and I've always been very protected. I've never been able to come and go as I want, so I asked my father if I could be on my own for a few days. He agreed, but only if I had security guards. The men in sunglasses, Benny exclaimed. Yes, they were hired by my father to look after me. I'm sorry they frightened you. She touched Violet's arm. I wanted to tell you not to be afraid of them, but then you would have known my secret. Did you enjoy your freedom? Henry asked teasingly. I loved every minute of it, Myra said, especially going sightseeing with my new friends. I'll always remember you when I think of Washington, D.C. Look, there's the limousine, Benny cried. It's right in front of Mrs. Parsons. That's my father, Myra said, walking more quickly. He comes by to pick me up. I want you to meet him. A few minutes later, all the Aldens met Myra's father, a friendly man with dark hair and flashing eyes. Thank you for taking such good care of my daughter, he said solemnly. I'm afraid we must leave now. Your suitcases are in the trunk, Myra. We're going to miss you, Violet said impulsively. She scribbled her address on a piece of paper and handed it to Myra, who was getting into the back seat. There were two men in sunglasses in the front seat. Myra looked at the note and smiled. All right to you, she promised. There's Grandfather, Benny shouted just then. He pointed to a familiar car that turned the corner and pulled up to the curb. Grandfather, it's so good to see you. Jessie and Benny hugged their grandfather before he was even out of the car. I hope everyone had a good time, Mr. Alden said, climbing out and embracing Violet and Henry. We did, Benny chanted, and we solved 2 mysteries. 2 mysteries? Grandfather asked. I'm really impressed. We didn't really solve the mystery about our Myra, Violet pointed out. She explained it to us. It still counts, Benny insisted. Doesn't it, Grandfather? Well, I'm not sure, Grandfather said, walking up the steps. He smiled. But I can't wait to hear all about it. And that, boys and girls, is the end of our book, of our read aloud.
Yeah,
That was a good one? Yeah, you like that. So we found out about the two mysteries, the men in sunglasses, as well as who was stealing all the stuff. Pretty good. All right. Well, perhaps next year we can read another boxcar, children, if you guys want. We'll have to see. I also have some other good plans for read alouds next year. Until then, happy reading. Keep reading all summer long. I love you guys, and I'll see you later. Bye.